Welcome back to the Global Indian Podcast, home to the greatest conversations and the official platform for open and liberal minds. Yes, let's face it, we are everywhere. Now, as you know, every single week we plunge ourselves into the human experience behind our perceptions of identity, take a second look at the countries where people of Indian origin call home, and tackle the big conversations. Well, this week there's been a lot happening across the globe, but there's one thing that we've always discussed on here, which is this industry that is now emerging called the CBI, Citizenship by Investment Programs. It's taken the world by storm, and we're seeing a plethora of organizations setting up in India to help the high net worth and the ultra high net worth take passports and move abroad. But it seems that there's a lot more than meets the eye. And as you would have heard in previous podcasts, countries such as Dominica, as well as some of the other countries in the Caribbean, have suffered some issues when it comes to transparency. Now, to help guide me through this process of sorts, I'm joined by a friend of the platform, Kenneth. Now, Ken's name probably rings a bell to you because when we did our episode on Dominica, his articles mentioned. Now, he has a great deal of understanding about the industry as a whole and has also got an incredible blog that looks to expose some of the deeper issues that most people don't realize. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest on the show. Kenneth, it is great to have you here.
Thank you, Rajan. It's nice to be there with you as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, my name is Kenneth Rijock. I'm a financial crime consultant located in Miami, Florida. And in my misspent youth, I spent 10 years of my life as a career money launderer. During that period of time, St. Kitts and Nevis, a Caribbean British possession, became independent. And they initiated the first of what would be many citizenship by investment passport programs. Now, what is a CBI program? Although it usually goes by a number of other names. CIB, IIM, quite a number of different aliases, but by and large, it's a program through which a foreign national from a country that probably doesn't have visa-free entry to many nations can buy a passport and thereby get into the EU or perhaps the UK or even North America without the necessity of applying for and appearing for a visa, which I'm sure you know is tedious, time-consuming, and expensive, especially if you're from the developing world and you really don't want to wait 6 months to get that visa, if you get it at all. Back in 1983, William Herbert, who was then the foreign minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, introduced the CBI program, frankly, because his country's economy was in such bad shape that they needed to find another source of funding. By selling and offering passports and citizenships to all comers for 6 figures and up, they then were allowed to increase the income into the local treasury and defray some of the exorbitant expenses. You know that most of these small tax havens have small populations and small tourism-related economies, but large budgets, especially for all of their overly burdensome cabinets and government officials. So what Dr. Herbert did was he created a position whereby people could come from all over the world, ostensibly legitimate purchasers, and then go ahead, buy a citizenship and a passport, which then, of course, let them into the EU as well as the UK visa-free. Whether or not you want to consider that this is an ethical program is something maybe we can cover down the road. But fortunately or unfortunately, the truth be that the late Dr. Herbert, besides being a foreign minister over in St. Kitts and Nevis and His Majesty's constitutional advisor over in Anguilla, which was a British possession, he was, for better or for worse, a money launderer for narcotics traffickers, which led to his early demise a long time ago. But that's another story.
Well, that sounds like a very important part of the story there, Ken, because if you're saying it was set up and instituted by this guy who was a known money launderer, and obviously you were around those spheres, well, that tells you a lot about the integrity and the trust that we place within the governments that institute these programs. And this comes at a time where you have the EU shouting out saying we're going to ban CBI. You know, it's wrong. It's allowing a lot of foreign corporates to come into the nation. You've got the US that's up in arms. Obviously, Canada has taken very direct measures while cutting ties with certain countries when it comes to visa-free access. St. Kitts and Nevis is a case in point there. Now, going back a couple of steps, you were in your younger youth, obviously involved in money laundering, and you look at the CBI industry. Now, why did the CBI industry work in that sphere? What did it provide people that were from that type of ilk that no other industry could?
Well, the point is that if you are a money launderer or some other financial criminal, say a fraudster, you probably have an opportunity not just to get a new nationality and a new passport, but a new identity. Because, like it or not, the level of due diligence and enhanced due diligence that these jurisdictions exercised was either substandard or non-existent. Why? Because in many cases, there was a lot of cash paid under the table for unsuitable applicants to get that passport. CBI only works if there's adequate due diligence. And in my experience, there has yet to be a jurisdiction that has measured up to what we call best banking practices of due diligence. Therefore, a lot of people squiggle in under the rug underneath the minimum amount of investigation that's necessary, and then they go on to commit financial crimes and be exposed as transnational criminals. So CBI will only work if and only if there's due diligence. But the programs have attracted like a magnet the financial criminals of the world, intelligence agents, individuals who are intent on fraud or other financial crimes, terrorist financiers, all of the kind of people that you do not want to have an innocent new passport, perhaps in an alias, which will allow them to come into the UK or the EU without so much as a by your leave.
But these are extraordinary claims, but I'm sure that these claims are also backed up by evidence. So do you have some examples of the wrong people coming through? Other people that have been involved in terror financing or those who are involved in unscrupulous activities?
The problem is that the 5 countries in the East Caribbean who sell CBI passports, as well as Malta, which is the only holdover left in the EU, all have long histories of selling passports to individuals from Russia, Iran, the Middle East, even North Korea, not to mention your garden variety of the usual suspects, people involved in financial crime. The internet is full of these nightmares and stories because they go back 25 years. And there has never been anybody who's been able to clean up their jurisdiction sufficiently to stop financial criminals from gaining access. Remember that it's compounded by the fact that not only are they selling what we call economic citizenships or economic passports, a number of these very corrupt government officials are also selling covertly passports which constitute diplomatic passports. Now, these people are not qualified under the UN rules because they're never acting as credentialed diplomats, but try going through and evading customs in a third world country with a diplomatic passport. It's as easy as pie. So if you want to bring a lot of cash or financial instruments into a country in the developing world, just get one of those diplomatic passports, come in with an entourage, including bodyguards, and you will be whisked around customs, taken to the VIP room, and you will be able to come into that country with God knows what kind of money laundering financial instruments that you wish to clean up.
I remember seeing something of you when you said that in your previous life that you're working as a money launderer. You said that there was one destination that you used to go to. I think it was Anguilla, I believe. And the way that you did that was that everybody dressed up as lawyers, as bankers, and enabled you to have clean, direct access within those countries. And those countries turned a blind eye at that moment in time because they realized just how important that money is. Now, is that the case of the CBI industry still? Do you think that governments realize that that the transparency isn't there, but because they're basing 40% of their economy towards that area that they're just turning that blind eye, not necessarily wanting to, but they're forced to do so because they realize the dire straits that they'll be in if that financial model didn't work?
Well, you can probably go back in your history and blame the United Kingdom, because back in the 60s and the 70s, when it granted independence to all of these British overseas territories, frankly, it left them without functioning economies. And the young lawyers in those countries, in desperation, turned to whatever would work. And that's how they ended up with citizenship by investment programs. The problem is that although today bulk cash smuggling, back in the old 1980s Miami Vice period, doesn't always happen, today people can still launder money through CBI programs by going to a CBI consultancy somewhere in a no holds barred jurisdiction like Dubai and depositing all sorts of fugitive cash, which then gets wired into the CBI jurisdiction. So it may not be as crude, rude, and lewd as it was before, but it's still just as effective. And it's still somebody allows an individual with dirty money to clean some of it by getting his CBI passport, to also buy real estate there with the dirty money, and then eventually to use that passport for all sorts of financial crime around the globe in the future.
If it's as bad as you say it is, and bearing in mind we're living in a world right now where we have this rise in national identities, people are holding on and saying, well, you cannot buy into our countries anymore. There's great examples around the world for that. But if it is as bad as you say it is, why is the EU not doing more? Why are they not stamping this out, especially with the issues taking place with Russia?
Okay, well, they managed to stop the CBI programs in Cyprus and in Bulgaria. And Malta's the sole EU holdout, sole EU member still doing that. And they are literally suing them in the European Court of Justice to terminate the program. Under European Union rules, if you're going to hold a passport for a particular country in Europe, you need to have all sorts of ties to that country. You're supposed to live there at least part of the time. You're supposed to know the language. You're supposed to actually have connections there. You can't just be a Russian, buy a Maltese passport, and then use it to move money from Venezuela into Switzerland, which is what's been happening.
Why does it bother you, Ken? Because I look at the work that you've done, and the reason why it's kind of interested us is there's been large cases where you had people of Indian origin involved. And some of these cases, you're talking about billions in terms of corruption of what's taking place with banks, for example, allegedly. And that has a knock-on effect for future generations. But on your side, you've dedicated a number of years exposing some of these bigger issues. I can imagine that comes at a cost as well. Why bother?
Well, it's all about banking compliance, because whether you're a bank compliance officer in North America or in Western Europe, every year, federal and government regulations get tougher and more difficult, and they require you to be the gatekeeper. So if you're a banker in New York, the last thing that you want is to have a financial criminal obtain a squeaky clean new identity, use it to move dirty money through your bank, which then exposes you to a huge civil penalty from the US government, or worse, some of your people actually being arrested and charged with basically acting blind when it comes to money laundering. So therefore, as a former compliance officer, I can see that that's a clear and present danger to bankers, because these identities, which are manufactured through the CBI process, are now so squeaky clean that you can't penetrate them using customer due diligence, and you're at the mercy of some of the world's most sophisticated money launderers. That's why it's a problem.
Give me an idea. Give the audience an idea. We have ministers from the EU that will be listening in. We got heads of states. We got former heads of states. And I know, I dare say, many people across the Caribbean in some of the locations where the CBI industries play a pivotal role towards their economic development. Give me an idea in terms of funds. How much illicit funds do you think have been funneled through the CBI industry? And what do you think needs to actively change? Because there must be some genuine needs for this. But what you're saying is for every one great need, there's probably a few others that are using for another reason.
Well, frankly, there's no you know, recognizable conservative figure as to how many tens of millions of dollars are being used globally to buy the passports, and how many hundreds of millions or maybe even billions of dollars are being washed using the passports. The problem is that the world is casting a blind eye, and it says, well, CBI passports are good because if you're a wealthy individual, a high net worth person, and you live in a country where you really can't get access elsewhere, it facilitates your international travel, your resettlement, your investments. The problem is that all you need are a small percentage of people using it for ill, and the whole program becomes a danger. And frankly, since nobody actually will take the time and the expense to bulletproof the compliance at those programs, they really shouldn't be operating, because it's just a perfect storm for a financial crime.
Where does the money go to? So a country gains a passport, it sells a passport, and it's supposed to go towards national prosperity building, for example. In your years of research, does anything touch the people of the country? Is any good made from this industry?
Well, rarely, because remember, most of these countries have they are engorged with official budgets, meaning that here's a small country with 100,000 people that maintains a full diplomatic staff abroad and has no end of cabinet members and assistants. Remember, in a country with a very small economy, many people will gravitate towards official jobs. So there's part of the problem. Then you have, of course, the problem that when you have individuals who come in to set up the programs, that they always involve, you have to buy a piece of real estate, which makes it look like you live there, as well as pay for your passport. Well, a lot of these programs, a lot of these construction projects, while they employ a couple people in the country, they're transitory. And in many cases, they're not even completed. But since most of the buyers end up with a passport, they're not going to complain.
I think, do you know what, that's something that I've seen. I've been to a lot of the Caribbean destinations, and there's an elephant in the room scenario whereby you got incredible areas of outstanding beauty and you got a carcass of a building. And most times when they are selling off these rooms, they're at highly inflated prices. So for those who are bona fide buyers, who believe that they are buying into a dream, something that is essentially their nest egg, they've, one, paid over the odds for a piece of property. Secondly, that property is very rarely finished from a lot of the projects that I've seen. And when they are, to be able to sell it for a profit in the future, well, you know, I think even Ray Charles can see that there's another scenario there. When you look forward, when you look towards the future of this industry as a whole, obviously you've kind of uncovered some of the biggest issues taking place in these jurisdictions. Do you think anything's going to change?
Well, only if the public starts to wake up and realize that you put yourself in a bullseye when you get one of these passports. While they may give you visa-free access to the UK and the EU and a number of other places, perhaps Commonwealth of Nations jurisdictions, at the same time, you are buying a passport in a country that is generally a known tax haven and money laundering destination, as well as a favorite of terrorist financiers. So let's say you are an Indian national and you want to have visa-free access in Europe, so you buy a CBI passport from one of these East Caribbean states. Who's to say that you all of a sudden don't find out that you are now a person of interest to US and UK law enforcement because you bought a passport from a jurisdiction where every third person that buys them is involved in money laundering? And you find out one day when you come into the United States that you are interrogated, that your goods and all of the bags and baggage that you have are sent through an X-ray machine, and you're definitely made very uncomfortable because while you haven't been accused of being a financial criminal, that's certainly what it looks like. So if you are foolish enough to buy one of those passports, you need to understand that if you do so, you do so at your own risk.
So it's almost guilty by association, in other words.
Yes, not only that, but you're buying a passport in a country that doesn't respect the rule of law, and it could be arbitrarily voided at any time for any reason, and you don't have access to the court system, which is generally corrupt in any event. So you're buying a pig in a poke, which may work for a while, but it also might put you a bullseye on your head.
I think on the other side as well, it's making sure then that if you were to have to go down that route for legitimate reasons, and there are legitimate reasons, therefore you have to have a look at a country that upholds the ideas of transparency, because that will be held up in the court of public opinion. What processes do you have that actually showcases that this country has looked at every form of genuine due diligence, recorded that, and therefore is clear and open for people to see? Now, CBI is one side of this, obviously. But the other side that really fascinates me with you is that you've taken on a couple of these heads of states head on in the international press. So I've been reading a lot about the situation in Malta. Now, Malta is a very interesting destination for a lot of global Indians because there's a large community that have found themselves there since the 18th century. Can you run me through some of the bigger inner workings of Malta and what the CBI industry did to that type of jurisdiction?
Well, the country, like many offshore tax havens, was frankly abandoned by the UK with a very minimal economy.
Is the UK to blame for everything, Ken? That's what I'm getting the feeling from you.
Well, history, listen, I love the United Kingdom, but history tells us that they basically cast a lot of these territories adrift without adequate financing, and as such, allowed them to pretty much fend for themselves. So the problem with Malta is that it really doesn't have any industry or agriculture. It's a tiny little pair of islands south of Sicily that unfortunately has to survive. And as such, the jurisdiction, taking it back like more than a decade, actually enacted favorable tax legislation, which allowed a European company to come in there and pay only 5% corporate taxes. But at the same time, it developed an opaque quality to its corporate structure. And in 2013, the present ruling Labour Party came into power, and immediately there was an explosion of corruption and money laundering. At the same time that the CBI program, then called the IMIIM program, targeted Russians and other, frankly, high-risk individuals who came in there like gangbusters, buying passports and employing them for all sorts of nefarious ends. So therefore, Malta has become, quite candidly, a country with an exorbitant amount of money laundering, a lot of which is facilitated by the CBI program. Now, the reason I targeted the senior leadership is because, frankly, they're just as corrupt as the Maltese mafia, which operates there, the cousins to the Sicilian mafia. So the problem is that we have a country where just about anything goes, and you're free to contact somebody, get a passport, and take it abroad for whatever ends you desire.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because for a lot of people, when they look at their passport, it's that token of identity, of nationalism. And now you're saying that these passports, these identifiables for many people, is being sold in the open market. And almost everyone's made it a legitimate thing. Now, again, looking at the Malta experience there, I know that there's a lot more to the story. A journalist, unfortunately, was murdered in the country. You've had a lot of demonstrations there saying that there is a need for change, and the elections did come place, and there has been a change in government subsequently. There's been other big cases, obviously one when it comes to Malaysia, where again, billions of pounds or billions of dollars, same thing right now, I guess, went missing, and it found its way into places like Cyprus through to the Caribbean. It must be very frustrating because obviously you're on the inside at one stage. And when you were there, this would have been a welcome relief. But now you're on the other side and you're fighting against this. It just seems like it must be an endless war for you, Ken.
Well, the problem is that, there's not enough intestinal fortitude on behalf of the Western democracies to handle it. What they're doing is a Band-Aid approach. They'll try to make examples in big cases. But in the day-to-day operation of financial crime, they just don't devote the budgets and the manpower and the international expertise to shut these things down. Listen, the tax havens of the Caribbean, the 5 East Caribbean states, that is St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua, Dominica, St. Lucia, and Grenada, all of which run these programs, could be forced out of these illicit versions of CBI tomorrow. But the problem is that national sovereignty trumps effective action, and the United States and the UK don't want to be big brother and force these countries to abandon what's obviously a recipe for crime.
But that must be a welcome relief for any politician going into those countries where they realize that their CBI industry is 40% of their GDP at this moment in time.
Well, the problem is that PEPs, politically exposed persons, individuals who work or in government or in some official capacity anywhere in the world, are then able to divert money from official budgets, steal money however they can, and then hide it in these tax havens. And of course, hide their own identity so that one day they can retire, pick up their new identity, and move to a jurisdiction where they can't be extradited.
Actually, that is a point of call, because we don't often think about the CBI industry also supporting those corrupt officials in countries, that they can actually utilize it to change their own, as you rightly said, their own identities to be able to get away with so much. Now, there's a couple of countries that you mentioned there, again, places where you have a large proportion of Indian origin people. And what's really interesting is to see actually how the CBI industry has almost transformed. We've been involved. It's pretty much out there, having a look at these bigger questions, the existential issues when it comes to identities of those nations. But you got people in those countries who right now are suffering from high levels of unemployment, but yet those countries are still bringing billions towards their economy and then haven't seen any change. Those people haven't woken up as of yet. They haven't questioned the bigger issues at play. If they haven't done it so far, even post-COVID, do you think that they ever will do so? Like, what's keeping people from questioning the bigger issues that's keeping them oppressed almost?
Well, the trickle-down economics, thinking that all of the CBI profits, the CBI receipts and income will end up into helping the individual man in the street. While that's not true and it's flawed, what happens is that corrupt government leaders in these CBI jurisdictions, while they don't take care of the man in the street, when it comes to election time, they ensure that enough of that money is diverted to temporary Band-Aid type approaches where individuals who are voters receive cash payments, receive other sort of direct and indirect benefits so that they will perpetuate the regimes that are corrupt that run these programs. So therefore, in places like Dominica, for example, where the government pays expats to fly in every election from abroad at the government expense so that they can then vote the government back in again for another term. So they use some of that money for, frankly, an illicit purpose, and it works. But most of it does not trickle down.
That's interesting. Slightly off topic, obviously, because you were in that world of money laundering. Is it easier now to launder money than ever before?
Well, before, if you wanted to launder money, you would, of course, need to form a corporation in an offshore jurisdiction. You'd have to get on a plane. You'd have to go there. You'd have to find a lawyer corrupt enough that you could trust to form the companies and get you into the banks. Nowadays, you can do it in the privacy of your own home. You can form corporations online or purchase them. You can open bank accounts online. You can totally disguise who your beneficial owner client is, and you can do that all without leaving home. So is the internet facilitating money laundering and financial crime? Absolutely, making it infinitely harder for anybody to candidly disrupt it.
And would you then say that there's a strong connection between money laundering and politics and politicians?
Well, the problem is that in most countries, politicians are underpaid and underfed, greedy, ambitious, and not really being involved with adhering to ethical principles. Therefore, they'll take the shortcut to wealth, and therefore you have to beware, because they're going to take that laundered money every time, or they're going to facilitate its laundering.
So what would be the overall solution? Obviously, you've seen the worst of the worst. You've also experienced, every little trick that people can utilize. What is the best case scenario for the world at present, where we're seeing wars in Ukraine, Russia, for example, that's been pushed out there? We're seeing changes in people's lives, higher taxations than ever before. And then we know about these offshore centers. We know about a lot of these countries that are utilizing their tax haven status. If the world was governed by Ken and you could wave a magic wand, what would you do immediately to make it more of an equitable place?
Well, the first thing you have to do is candidly, we have to put the tax havens out of business. That doesn't mean those countries themselves, just those illicit programs. It would require a number of radical steps, such as the Western democracies use on terrorist states. It would mean basically sanctions to the extent that Americans and Europeans couldn't fly into those countries, couldn't transact any money there, could not be involved in any kind of business transactions, and as such, you would have to freeze any kind of economic relationship until they give up and cave in and say, okay, we'll stop our tax haven business, we'll stop our CBI, just stop us because we're starving here.
But then the blacklisting did take place at one stage, didn't it? They did try and do that with countries like Cayman, for example, that was blacklisted for a while, but it didn't serve the purpose of shifting or even stopping a lot of the programs that were happening there.
That's true, but it was ineffective because it was insufficient. If a European country makes it illegal for its citizens to even visit or fly over or utilize the national airlines going into that country, if tourism totally dries up because you're not allowed to transact business in the local currency, if you ban exports and imports into and out of a jurisdiction, their whole economy will crash within a few weeks. But nobody will take such radical steps because they seem to be interfering with our belief in international sovereignty and in operating with the big stick, which seems to have fallen out of favor in international relationships.
And that's actually an interesting question there. So the final one is any country truly sovereign? Because if you're saying it's down to big businesses operating there, it's down to funds finding its way in, FDI is a great word that's been spread across there. Is any country truly sovereign in its own right?
Well, the whole world turns on its economy, and that includes the government. So I agree with you that in the global world, everything is so interconnected, but that also gives you an opportunity to shut down things that you find to be interfering with the lawful commerce. The question is, does anybody have the political will to do so?
And I think that's a great way to end the podcast off. It is fantastic having you on. I know that this is the first of many more conversations to be had, but on behalf of the entire global Indian family, as well as ambassadors around the world and the many listeners coming in, it has been fantastic having you on here today.
Thank you, Raja.
Thank you.